I want to talk for the sports topic this week. I was kind of inspired by Andrei Rublev last week. I talked a little bit about it on TikTok. I don't necessarily know how much of it I've talked about it here on the show itself. But what was it? I think it's almost a week ago. Andrei Rublev basically posted on his Instagram that no war, please. Or sorry, he didn't post on his Instagram. After a match at the Dubai Tennis Championships, he wrote on a camera saying "No war, please," and it was kind of this symbol of athletic activism that we've grown so used to seeing, particularly here in American society, with the recent emergence of Colin Kaepernick and other Black athletes standing up for what's right, anthem protests and stuff like that. I think our generation is well acquainted with athletic activism, if I don't say so myself. And I think one of the things that I really wanted to do this topic about was because this Russia-Ukraine thing has come to light, and it's brought up a lot of questions for me, but it's also brought up a lot of inquisitive curiosity, so to speak. And I've really wanted to sort of figure out like what is exactly, who are some of the players and athletes that have really broken that social justice mold and like have advanced the conversation. I mean, when you talk about athletes taking a stand, you have so many, right? I feel like for Americans, we instantly think about players that broke the color barrier in whatever sport that may have been, whether that be the MLB, the NBA, the NFL. I mean, you think of Jackie Robinson, right? Being one of the first in baseball to break that color barrier. A lot of other American athletes that we know well. I mean, Jesse Owens is another one that comes to mind. Not necessarily like breaking the color barrier, but like being one of the first like African Americans to medal. And the stuff with the 36 Olympics and all that. But there's been, when you think of protests, especially in the modern day, but also kind of in the 20th and 21st century, you think of a few. I think the big ones, in my opinion, like historically speaking, are like Muhammad Ali and the Vietnam War. I think that's a really big one. With his protesting his boxing career, essentially. The U.S. boycotted the Olympics in 1980 to kind of prevent against that invasion of, or to boycott against the Soviet Union's invasion of Afghanistan. Colin Kaepernick kneeling for the anthem and the various kind of antics and off the field stuff that have gone on with that. And Donald Sterling, which is one that actually got swept under the rug a little bit. I think people have kind of forgotten about that one. That was basically a white NBA owner basically getting caught for saying a lot of like racist things towards his African American players, and he was eventually fired. And as a result, the players also, enacted an act of protest where they kind of put their warm-up shirts inside out before a playoff game in front of a national audience. It was a pretty big deal. But those are ones that are pretty well heard of, and they're pretty well covered by the media. So I feel like I don't need to talk about those a lot. I've also talked about Colin Kaepernick, but I want to talk about some of the protests that maybe you haven't heard of necessarily, because there has been a variety of protests throughout the years that have taken place at all sorts of events, and people, frankly, haven't really paid much attention to. And one of those places that I feel like protests really take place very often, and maybe as an American audience member, which it's no fault of anybody's, you don't understand the context of what's going on. And also, a lot of protests have happened before the era of social media and TV, where it's just so readily available to be shared and all of these things via Twitter and whatnot. There has been a variety, I think, in my opinion, of flag protests during the Olympic Games. That's the big one. And the Olympics in general has been seen as kind of one of the huge places that these flag protests have taken place at. One of the main protests that I remember in my recent times is the Irish flag protest. Or no, it's not even in my lifetime. What am I saying? God damn it. But one of the protests that I was like doing a little bit of research into recently is the Irish flag protest. And the Irish flag protest was basically a flag protest that took place way back in 1906, back before I was even, the letter A was even spelt in my name. There was this athlete by the name of Peter O'Connor, and he was supposed to compete under the Irish flag, under the broad jump category. So he was going to broad jump for Ireland. It was, he was going to compete in the Olympics and all these things, and he thought he was good to go. But at the last second, there was a technicality. And basically what they were told was that Ireland couldn't compete in the Olympics because they didn't have an Olympic council. And so as a result, Irish athletes were absorbed into Great Britain. So they basically became one nation. So the Irish athletes were forced to basically wear the flag of Great Britain if they wanted to compete, and so on and so forth. So Peter O'Connor, ended up going to the Olympics, and he ended up doing really well, and he ended up medaling. He got a silver medal at in broad jump at the Olympics, and so he gets up to the podium, and everybody's expecting, the British flag to reign high because he was technically representing Great Britain. But at the last second, O'Connor jumps off the podium and just scales the flagpole as fast as he can, and he apparently snuck an Irish flag onto the track, and he hung that instead of the British flag that was supposed to hang. And all his sort of fellow Irish athletes that were under the banner of Great Britain were protecting him at the bottom to make sure he wasn't escorted away by security, or that Great Britain Olympic officials weren't all over him and stuff like that. So it was pretty cool. And it was overall just like a really interesting act of protest that I feel like hasn't really been talked about in a lot of ways. There isn't a lot about it, but it was kind of one of those ones that was very little, but meant a lot, because it was like, you're not going to show that my country exists, but I will. Is what that one felt like. I think another, and not to transition real abruptly, but another big Olympic protest was 1968. The 1968, for those of you that don't know, the 1968 Olympics were, it was a huge, that protest has gone down in history now. I feel like if you don't know what it is, if you've seen the iconic image of the fists with the black gloves being held up, and that's the one I'm talking about, with Johnny Smith and John Carlos holding their fists in the air, kind of protesting against African American inequalities that were going on in America at the time. And the craziest part is what I didn't realize, because I thought, like, as a history person, like, wow, like, it was such a heroic moment. There's pictures documenting it. You look in most history classes, there's an image of that protest. You go to San Jose State University, which is 10-15 minutes away from my house. There's a beautiful statue that kind of replicates the event and everything. And these guys are looked at as heroes. But in reality, Johnny Smith and John Carlos basically were lambasted for this. They were blacklisted from athletics, and personal relationships essentially took a hit to the point where they may be remembered as heroes today, and they may be remembered as historical figures who are absolutely, looked at as in such a positive light. But the reality was that at the time, they basically could never compete again. They could never go to the Olympics. They could never, run track at a competitive level. And a lot of personal relationships that maybe they built weren't there anymore, because the 60s were a much more fragile time. And it's kind of that saying that there's a proverb where it's like, before you learn to run, you have to walk. And I think that's so applicable to Colin Kaepernick, because Colin Kaepernick was met with, yes, so a lot of criticism from a lot of people, but also there were a shit ton of members of the media and the public that were so willing to put their arms around Colin Kaepernick. In 1968, Johnny Smith and John Carlos got none of that. They got crapped on, as I mentioned earlier. And so for Kaepernick to have the success he did, you needed to have these protests in the past for African American inequality that maybe didn't go as positively within the public eye. So it's very interesting to look at it in hindsight and just see how these protests in the past have sort of built on protests here in the future, or protests in the present, which is cool. And as recently as 2021 in the Olympic trials, there was a girl that I believe who turned her back to the American flag. I do not know the exact reason, but there's protests like this, very subtle things that happen on, at most Olympic events. It's truly one of the bigger events in sports, and one of the bigger events in where you have that international audience, because a lot of people are watching, and it's pretty incredible to see. I've also argued that I don't think the Olympics are necessarily a popular event in sports. The popularity has been dragging over the last 15, 20 years, particularly in my generation. I think maybe 30, 40 years ago, doing the things that Johnny Smith did, and John Carlos, that's international news. Everybody saw that, because the Olympics were just such a big deal, and no one questioned to not watch the Summer Olympics back then. But now, 2021 had the Summer Games. How popular was that? The Winter Olympics just passed. How popular was that? But that's neither here nor there. That's not related to the point that I'm trying to make. But for Russia and Ukraine, let's tie this all back, right? We talked about these protests in a variety of ways, but like with Russia and Ukraine, let me ask you this very simple question. What responsibility does an athlete have to take a stand? What responsibility do athletes have to take a stand? And in my opinion, there's quite a few Russian athletes that I have seen that have remained relatively quiet about the situation, haven't made public statements, haven't been in the public eye condoning the actions of the Russian government. Does that automatically mean that they support the actions of Russia? Do they have to speak out in against Russia? Is that a requirement of them to make sure that they are against Russia? I mean, you can look at Peng Shui. Peng Shui made, a statement against a government official saying that he sexually assaulted her on a social media platform, and the country presumably has her under a strict lockdown. We don't even know what the hell's going on with Peng Shui. I mean, athletes probably look at that and they're like, dude, what if that's me? You don't think like that thought has crossed Russia? I think that thought has crossed some Russian athletes' minds. Like, holy crap, what if I go home and all the next thing I know, I'm in a Russian prison for absolutely no reason? What if that is the case? Because the reality is you don't know what's going to happen, particularly in these oppressive governments. So athletes have to worry about that risk. And taking a stand is an incredibly personal decision, right? I think in the case of Russia and Ukraine, listen, obviously what the Russian government is doing is fucked up. And I think it's universally recognized as the Russian government is doing something wrong. But the thing is, I think in this case, I would lean personally on the side of you should speak out. I would personally like to think that if I was in a Russian athlete situation or a Russian person of semi importance, I would speak out against my country. But I can't make that call. I can't sit here and tell you, yo, you have to speak out, because it's your call at the end of the day. If you feel like it's a safety risk, if you feel like you're a quieter person, that's your personality, you don't really want to talk about it publicly, that's all you. Right? They have platforms. Totally, they have platforms. I'm not saying that, a lot of Russian athletes don't have platforms. They do. But at the end of the day, it depends on the situation. It depends on the person. And if you want to do that, then you'll do it. And athletes should be able to speak out in whatever fashion they want. They're humans like us. You can't deny that. And just because we live in an era where social media followers and all of these things mean more, does not mean that you can expect every single athlete to speak out. And if they don't speak out, it doesn't mean that they're against a certain issue, or they look at an issue a certain way, or we should go immediately to cancel them and wonder why they've been awfully quiet about something, right? I think that's where I'm kind of torn on, is this whole idea of like, yes, like what the country is doing is wrong, and we can all admit that, but also, where should I speak out? Why should they speak out against Russia? Maybe it's a safety risk. Maybe they have to go back to Russia. Maybe they have family in Russia that could potentially be harmed by their actions. It's a lot more things to think about than just, oh, is this athlete against what Russia's doing? Should we cancel them? Right? It's a complicated situation. I feel like athletes taking a stand is it's a much more nuanced issue than maybe what you may look at on the surface here. And that's kind of what I wanted to get at, is what responsibility do athletes have to take a stand? Because in my opinion, I think they do have a stand. They do have a responsibility to be aware of certain things that are going on within society and contextually. But I don't think that we should look to athletes to constantly be making a stand for every single issue. Right? I'm sure Black athletes are tired. I'm sure that there are some Black athletes out there who are happy to speak out, right? Happy to, every single time there's something that happens to the African American community, they are happy to be the first person to come out with a statement and be like, this is fucked up. Like, what are we doing? But I'm sure there are also Black athletes out there that are like, bro, I'm just trying to focus on playing basketball, and I I can't do this. Like, there's so many things. It's negatively affecting me. And I don't know what the thought process is for Russian tennis players. I mean, not for tennis players, but Russian athletes in general. I'm pretty sure for Russian athletes, they're probably sitting there like, yo, bro, My family's lives could be on the line. I don't know what this government's capable of. If I speak out against them tomorrow, I could be risking the lives of my brothers and sisters that live in Russia. And that's totally valid too. So that's what I'm saying is like examine the point. And I was using the black athlete example as trying to like relate it to an example back here in the States. But athletes taking a stand, it's a very complicated history. It's very interesting. But also keep in mind that not every athlete has to do it in order to be like socially woke, quote unquote, in this era. In my opinion, at least. I'm curious to see what you have to say.